In October 2022, a journalist drove through West Virginia to clear her head. She saw hundreds of birds watching her from power lines. She took a shortcut locals avoid after dark. Something ran beside her car. Something landed on her roof. And 3 days later, someone she loved almost died. I want to start by saying that I don't consider myself a superstitious person. I grew up in a Vietnamese-American household where my grandmother burned incense and left offerings for ancestors, but I always chalked that up to culture rather than genuine belief. I studied journalism. I deal in facts. I deal in evidence. I don't believe in things I can't see and verify, but I saw the Mothman, and now I believe. My name is Carrie Nguyen. I'm 31 years old and I live in Columbus, Ohio. In October 2022, I drove from Columbus to Virginia to visit my college roommate, Elena, who had just moved to Richmond for a new job. It was about a 6-hour drive, and I decided to make it a road trip take. The scenic route through West Virginia instead of the boring straight shot down I-70. I'd been working 60-hour weeks for 3 months straight at my newspaper job. I was burnt out, exhausted, running on caffeine and stubbornness. My editor had finally forced me to take a week of vacation, and this drive felt like the first breath I'd taken in months. Just me, my car, a good playlist, and some of the most beautiful fall scenery in the country. I left Columbus on a Friday morning, October 14th. The plan was to drive down through Athens, cross into West Virginia at Huntington, follow Route 2 along the Ohio River, pass through Point Pleasant, then cut east through the mountains to Richmond. It would take longer than the direct route, but I wasn't in a hurry. I want to paint you a picture of what the drive was like because the atmosphere matters. It matters a lot. Route 2 through West Virginia in mid-October is one of the most beautiful drives I've ever taken. The Ohio River runs along your left, wide and gray and ancient looking. On your right, the hills rise up covered in trees that had just hit peak fall color. Deep reds and burning oranges and yellows, so bright they almost hurt to look at. The sky that day was low and heavy with clouds, the kind of overcast that turns everything slightly gray and makes the fall colors pop even more by contrast. It was maybe 50 degrees outside, and I had my windows cracked just enough to smell the leaves and the river. There was almost no traffic. I drove for long stretches without seeing another car. The towns along Route 2 are small, some of them barely more than a few houses and a gas station, and between them there's just the road and the river and the hills. It felt like driving through a painting, like driving through a dream. I was maybe an hour into the West Virginia portion of the drive when I first noticed the birds. They were sitting on the power lines. Black birds, crows or ravens. I couldn't tell from the car lined up on the wires in perfect rows. Every power line I passed was loaded with them. Hundreds and hundreds of black birds, all perfectly still, all facing the same direction. Facing me. I slowed down to look at them. They didn't move, didn't scatter the way birds usually do when a car passes. They just sat there, watching. Row after row after row of dark eyes. I sped up and kept driving. The birds kept appearing. Every set of power lines for the next 10 miles was lined with them, and every group faced the same direction. Watching my car pass, I told myself it was migration season, that birds gather in large groups in fall, that it meant nothing, but it felt like something. I reached Point Pleasant around 3 p.m. If you don't know Point Pleasant, let me tell you about it. It's a small town, maybe 4,000 people, sitting at the confluence of the Kanawha and Ohio rivers in Mason County, West Virginia. It's a pretty town in a faded kind of way, with Victorian houses and old brick storefronts and a riverfront park. But it's famous for one thing. In November and December of 1966, Point Pleasant became the epicenter of one of the strangest events in American folklore. Over a 13-month period, dozens of residents reported seeing a large creature, dark, humanoid, with enormous wings and glowing red eyes. The local newspaper called it the Mothman. People saw it on back roads near the old TNT plant north of town, hovering over cars, perched on buildings. And then, on December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge collapsed. The Silver Bridge was a suspension bridge connecting Point Pleasant to Gallipolis, Ohio. It was rush hour on a December afternoon when the bridge suddenly gave way, sending 46 people to their deaths in the icy Ohio River below. It was one of the deadliest bridge disasters in American history. After the collapse, the Mothman sightings stopped. Just. Or, like it had been trying to warn people and nobody listened. I knew all of this because I'd done a story on the Mothman phenomenon 2 years earlier for a regional magazine piece. I'd interviewed researchers, historians, and a few of the original witnesses who were still alive. I was skeptical. There's always a rational explanation. But I'd been fascinated enough to read everything I could find. And now, here I was, driving into Point Pleasant on a gray October afternoon, planning to stretch my legs, grab some coffee, maybe visit the famous Mothman Museum on Main Street. I parked near the riverfront and walked around. The town was quiet. A few locals going about their business, a handful of tourists at the Mothman statue, a 12-foot silver sculpture of the creature that had become the town's unlikely mascot. I took some photos of the statue, wandered through the museum, bought a postcard. Normal tourist stuff, nothing unsettling. I got back to my car around 4:30 p.m. The sun was already getting low. Days are short in October, especially in a river valley surrounded by hills. I had about 2.5 hours of daylight left and about 4 hours of driving to Richmond. I pulled up my route on my phone. A suggested shortcut appeared. Take Route 62 north out of town, cross the new bridge over the Ohio River, and pick up Route 35 on the other side. It would save about 20 minutes. I took the shortcut. I should not have taken the shortcut. Route 62, north of Point Pleasant, runs through an area the locals call the McClintock Wildlife Management Area. Most people know it better by another name, the TNT area. During World War II, the government built an explosives manufacturing plant here. When the war ended, they abandoned it, leaving behind a maze of concrete igloos where they'd stored munitions scattered through hundreds of acres of marsh and forest. This was where most of the Mothman sightings had occurred in 1966 and 1967. I knew this. I drove through it anyway. It's hard to explain what the TNT area feels like in person. The road runs through dense forest that closes in on both sides. The light was fading fast, turning everything that deep blue-gray of early dusk. Every few hundred yards, you'd see an abandoned concrete structure through the trees, the old munitions, igloos, overgrown with vines and moss, looking like ancient ruins. The marsh stretched out in the gaps between trees, the water black and still. No power lines here, no birds, just silence. I had my windows cracked from earlier and hadn't thought to close them. The air coming in was cold now, heavy with the smell of mud and leaves and something else. Something organic and wrong that I couldn't identify. Like wet animal fur, but darker somehow, more rancid. I noticed I had no cell signal, not unusual in rural West Virginia, but the timing made my stomach clench. I turned up the music, some indie playlist I'd made for the trip. The song cut out, not like it buffered or skipped, it just stopped mid-note, like someone had hit pause. The screen on my phone showed it was still playing, the timer still counting up, but there was no sound. Then my headlights flickered. I tapped the dashboard like that ever does anything. They flickered again, then steadied. The smell got stronger. I was about halfway through the TNT area when I saw the first shape. It was in the trees to my right, moving parallel to my car. Something large, dark, keeping pace with me. I could see it between the tree trunks, just glimpses, just fragments, but enough to tell it was big. Bigger than a deer. Moving on two legs. I sped up. It sped up. It sped up. I pushed the car to 50 on a road that probably had a speed limit of 35. The shape stayed with me, keeping pace effortlessly, moving through dense forest faster than any animal I'd ever seen. Then it was gone. Just stopped appearing between the trees. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and eased off the gas. That's when something landed on my car. I felt it before I heard it. A massive impact on the roof, like someone had dropped a boulder from above. The car shuddered. My hands jerked on the wheel, and I nearly swerved off the road. Whatever it was heavy. The roof over my head bowed slightly inward from the weight. I screamed. I'm not embarrassed to admit that. I screamed and floored the accelerator. The thing on my roof shifted its weight. I could feel it moving up there, repositioning, like it was trying to hold on. I heard sounds from above, something scraping across metal, and underneath that, something that I can only describe as a chirping sound. High-pitched and rapid, like a bat, but deeper, more resonant. It vibrated in my chest. I kept driving, faster and faster. 70 miles an hour on a winding forest road in near darkness. The trees were a blur on either side. My headlights were cutting wild arcs across the road as I took curves too fast. Whatever was on my roof, I could feel it gripping the metal. I could feel the weight of it shifting when I turned. And then I cleared the trees. The bridge appeared in my headlights. A modern bridge over the Ohio River, lights glinting off the dark water below. The moment I hit the bridge, the weight lifted. Gone. Just like that. 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't. I got across the bridge and pulled off on the Ohio side, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the car into park. I sat there for a full 5 minutes, just breathing, before I got out to look at the roof. There were marks in the metal. Long gouges, like something with enormous claws had gripped the roof on both sides. 4 parallel scratches on the left, 4 on the right. The metal was bent slightly, pushed inward, like something impossibly heavy had stood up there. I took photos. 18 photos of the damage from every angle. Then I got back in my car and drove to Richmond without stopping. Elena met me at her door and immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened to you? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that." I showed her the photos of the roof. I told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Elena, who interrupts everyone. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You went through the TNT area," she said, "at dusk, alone." "I know." "Carrie, I grew up in West Virginia. Everyone in this state knows you don't go through the TNT area after dark. That's like Rule 1. "I didn't know that." "You literally wrote an article about the Mothman." I was skeptical. I didn't think. It doesn't matter if you think. It doesn't care if you think. She made me tea and sat with me while I stopped shaking. Later, she showed me something on her phone, a West Virginia paranormal forum she'd been a member of since high school. She found a thread about the TNT area and pointed to a series of posts. Multiple people had reported the same experience, something landing on their cars while driving through the TNT area. The weight, the chirping sound. the scratches. One post from 2019 read, "Whatever it is, it doesn't follow you past the bridge. The river seems to stop it. Get to the river and you're safe." Another from 2021, "My cousin says the Mothman lands on cars to warn people that it's trying to communicate. That if you ever feel something land on your roof in the TNT area, something bad is about to happen to someone you love, and it's trying to tell you." I put down the phone. Something bad is about to happen to someone you love. I called my mom. She was fine. I called my dad. Fine. I called my brother. Fine. I went to sleep that night still uneasy, but convinced I'd avoided whatever the warning was for. 3 days later, driving back to Columbus, I got a call from my editor. A colleague of mine, a photographer named Danny Park, who I'd worked with for 6 years, who was one of my closest friends at the paper, had been in a car accident the same night I drove through the TNT area. October 14th, around 5 p.m. He'd been driving home from an assignment, hit a patch of black ice on the highway, and gone off the road. His car had flipped twice. He survived, but just barely. Broken ribs, collapsed lung, fractured arm. He spent 3 days in the ICU. October 14th. The same evening, something landed on my car on Route 62. I don't know what to do with that information. I've turned it over in my mind 100 times, trying to find the rational explanation. Coincidence. Pattern recognition. The human brain's tendency to create meaning where there is none. But I keep coming back to the weight on my roof, the chirping sound, the claw marks in the metal, the moment it lifted off as I crossed the bridge. And the forum post. It's trying to warn you. If the Mothman was warning me, if there's even a possibility that's what happened, then what was I supposed to do with the warning? I didn't know Danny was in danger. I didn't know what it was trying to tell me. I just felt something land on my car and screamed and drove away. Is the warning useless if you can't understand it? Is that the tragedy of it? That it comes? That it tries to communicate, and we're just too human to understand what it's saying? Or maybe it wasn't a warning at all. Maybe it's just a creature, a living thing in those marshes that's been there for centuries, long before the bridges and the roads and the tourists with their cameras. Maybe it's curious about us, the same way we're curious about it. Maybe landing on my car was nothing more than an animal investigating something unfamiliar. Maybe, but it felt like more than that. In the moment, in the darkness, with that weight above me and that sound vibrating in my chest, it felt like communication. Like something trying desperately to bridge an impossible gap. I visited Danny in the hospital when I got back to Columbus. I sat next to his bed and held his hand and watched him breathe through the tubes and wires, and I thought about the Mothman, about what it means to know something terrible is coming and be unable to stop it, about how sometimes the warning and the tragedy arrive at the same time, about how all you can do is cross the bridge and hope. Danny recovered fully. He's back at work now. Sometimes I look at him across the newsroom and think about Route 62 and the bridge over the Ohio River and the thing that rode on my roof through the TNT area. I've never told him. Some things you carry alone. I drove through West Virginia again last spring. Different route. I stayed far from Point Pleasant, far from the TNT area. But as I crossed the state line, I looked up at the sky instinctively, searching. I don't know what I was hoping to see, or maybe I do, because here's the thing about the Mothman that nobody talks about. Not the tourists with their t-shirts, not the researchers with their theories, not the skeptics with their rational explanations. The people who saw it in 1966, the original witnesses, the ones who were terrified out of their minds. The ones who reported glowing red eyes and a wingspan wider than a car, most of them said the same thing when asked to describe how it made them feel. Not just fear. Something else. Grief. They said it made them feel grief. Like standing at a graveside before you knew who had died. That's what I felt on that bridge. When the weight lifted off my roof and I drove across the river and came out safe on the other side. Not relief, not triumph, grief. Like it had been trying to tell me something I'd never fully understand. Like I'd failed some test I didn't know I was taking. Like somewhere between the TNT area and the Ohio River, in the cold dark of that October evening, something ancient and unknowable had tried to reach across the gap between us. And I'd been too scared to listen. My car still has the marks on the roof. I've thought about getting them repaired, but I haven't. I don't know why. Maybe because some part of me isn't ready to erase the proof. Isn't ready to let the rational world smooth over the evidence that something impossible happened on Route 62. My coworkers ask about the marks sometimes. I tell them I hit a low-hanging branch in a parking garage. They believe me. Of course they believe me. It's the easiest explanation. But late at night, when the wind picks up and something taps against my window, I catch myself holding my breath, waiting, listening. Because whatever it was that found me on that road in West Virginia, whatever rode on my roof through the TNT area and disappeared at the bridge, it knew my name somehow. It knew who I was connected to. It knew what was coming. And if it did it once, it can do it again. And maybe next time I'll be ready. Maybe next time I'll understand what it's trying to say. Or maybe next time I won't make it to the bridge. Point Pleasant keeps its secrets close. The river is wide and dark and old. And somewhere out there in the marshes and the concrete ruins and the October dark, something with red eyes is watching the road, waiting for the next car to pass, waiting for someone new to warn.